Hello and welcome to an extremely sunny Yorkshire. When we think about the Bronte sisters, we tend to picture three isolated authors in a windswept parsonage on the Yorkshire moors writing some of the most powerful novels in English literature. But what if I told you that there was another woman in the house for over 20 years? Someone who very rarely gets mentioned, and I don't mean Tabby and Martha the servants, yet without whom the entire Bronte story may have looked very different. She is called Aunt Branwell, and you might find that sometimes I say aunt instead of aunt. Apologies for that, that's my southern accent getting confused. Her name was Elizabeth Branwell, and I think she is one of the most overlooked figures in the entire Bronte story, because when you really start to look closely at her life, she's not just a background presence or this stern Victorian aunt in the corner of the room. She is someone who leaves her home in Cornwall and she enters a household already marked by illness and grief, and quietly becomes one of the most central stabilising forces in the lives of Charlotte, Branwell, Emily and Anne Bronte. She helps raise them, she supports them financially, and she shapes their education, their reading and of course their routines. And she stays long after she might reasonably have gone home. So today I want to try and do something quite simple, but I think quite important. I want to ask, who was Aunt Branwell really, and why has she been so misunderstood for so long? So grab yourself a cup of tea, or in my case a nice cold drink, and let's dive in. And let's have a look around this beautiful, beautiful garden. So today I am in North Yorkshire and I am at Kipling Hall, and I filmed here before a little while ago, but it was cold. I think it was autumn time. Today I wanted to come because I wanted to look at the gardens and I wanted to walk around the flower beds and just take it in. It's such a beautiful day. I've been away with work and I just wanted to come back to the UK and just be surrounded by history and beauty, and they certainly have it here. So I'll take you around and we'll have a look. But I also thought a garden is a lovely place to think about Aunt Branwell, because even though she was quite stern at times, I think inside she probably did have quite a feminine side to her, and I'm sure she would appreciate walking around this beautiful, beautiful garden. Elizabeth Branwell was born on the 2nd of December 1776 in Penzance in Cornwall. She was the daughter of Thomas Branwell and Anne Carn, is that how you say it, Branwell? She was one of 12 children born into the Branwell family, although several died young, which is very sad and was quite common at the time. Elizabeth appeared to have been amongst the older surviving daughters in what was a very large, very close-knit Cornish family. The Branwells were a respectable and fairly prosperous Cornish family. Thomas Branwell worked as a merchant, and he was also involved in the excise service, and over time the family became quite well known in the Penzance society. They were not aristocrats or landed gentry, nothing like that, but they were comfortable and they were educated, socially connected people, and very much part of that professional middle class world in the late 18th century in Cornwall. And I think that background really matters because it changes how we tend to picture Aunt Branwell later on. Because sometimes people almost imagine her as this rather stern, shadowy figure who simply turned up in Haworth to look after the Bronte children. But actually, she began life in a very different world. She grew up in a busy coastal town full of trade, ships coming and going, and that constant movement. There were family networks, there were conversations, there was all of that. And Penzance at that time was a very lively port town, very different from the quiet isolation we tend to associate with Haworth. She would have received what was considered a respectable education for a woman of her class and generation. Nothing extreme, but enough to make her literate, well-read and able to hold her own in a conversation. And we do see that later on in her life because she clearly had opinions. She read widely and she was very much involved in the intellectual life of the household she later became part of. She was also part of a very close, interconnected family. One of her younger sisters, Maria Branwell, who would then obviously later marry Patrick Bronte and become the mother of Charlotte Branwell, Emily and Anne, as well as the two older sisters. So in a very real sense, Elizabeth Branwell is already woven into this Bronte story long before she'd even set foot in Yorkshire. At this stage of her life, you would assume she would simply remain in Cornwall close to her family. I mean, her social world and everything that she'd always known. The Branwells were well established in Penzance, and Elizabeth herself seemed to have been quite rooted there emotionally. Even much later in Haworth, there are accounts of her speaking quite nostalgically about Cornwall. I mean, the warmth, can't blame her, the jollity, the social life of the younger days. And then there is the question people always quietly ask, why did she never marry? And the truth is, we simply do not know. And I think it's really important not to invent a romantic tragedy where there might not have been one. But at the same time, it's hard not to let your imagination wander a little. I mean, Cornwall at the end of the 18th century was full of sailors and merchants and stories would be coming in from the sea, and sometimes I do find myself wondering whether there was ever someone she loved who simply never became part of her future. But whatever the reason, the fact that Elizabeth Branwell remained unmarried ended up shaping not just her own life, but the lives of the Bronte children as well, because when tragedy struck the Bronte family, she was the one person who was able to leave her home and step fully into their world. And what perhaps started, obviously, as this temporary duty slowly became something much longer than anyone else had ever really planned. It became the rest of her life. So, we know the Bronte family moved into the house in Thornton in May 1815. When you look at the timing of the children's births, it becomes very clear that Maria Bronte, the mother of the Brontes, was in a really demanding position at this point. She had very young children and she was running a household, and also she was pregnant again. So it's not hard to imagine that she would have needed support around her. So when Aunt Branwell appears in the record shortly after this, it actually makes quite a lot of sense. And we should probably pause here and think about what travel actually meant at that time, because it was not simple. So from Penzance in Cornwall, you were a very, very long way from Yorkshire, and travel would have involved a combination of overland carriage journeys and coastal or sea routes, often using packed ships that ran between Cornwall and London. It was a fairly common way of moving people and goods at the time, but it was slow and obviously weather dependent and not particularly comfortable. So even the act of getting from Cornwall to Yorkshire was not something done quite lightly. It required effort, it required intention. And once she arrived, what we can see quite quickly is that she's not treated as a visitor passing through. She becomes part of the household and she is present. She is involved in the daily running of the home. And very early on, we see her acting as godmother to the Bronte's second daughter, Elizabeth Bronte. And that detail is actually quite important because at that time, being a godparent was not just something symbolic, it carried real responsibility. It meant being part of a child's moral and religious upbringing. And in many cases, it also meant being someone who could be relied upon if anything happened to the parents. So this is not a casual role. This is a sign of trust, and it is a sign that she is already being brought quite closely into the centre of the family. And then, in 1816, she returns to Cornwall. And what stands out is the account of that departure is that it doesn't feel like a simple, just visited and I've gone home moment. There is emotion in it, there is affection, there is a sense of real farewell within the household, which tells us something quite important. she's already more than just a temporary helper at this point. She's already become part of the emotional structure of the family. And what this really shows is that she does not arrive in Yorkshire as someone with a fixed permanent role. That role forms over time. She comes to help, she returns home. As circumstances change again, she's drawn back into the family in a way that gradually becomes much more permanent than anyone could probably have expected at the beginning. Everything really changed in 1821. Because by this point, the Bronte family are now living at the parsonage in Haworth, and life inside the household becomes increasingly difficult. Maria Bronte, the children's mother, is seriously ill. I mean, most accounts point to cancer, and it's likely she'd been unwell for some time before things had obviously reached this critical stage. And by the summer of 1821, she is extremely weak, confined to her bed and rapidly declining. And then, almost unbelievably, the situation becomes even more serious because at the time, all 6 of the children fall ill with scarlet fever, which in the early 19th century was terrifying. I mean, today scarlet fever is usually treated with antibiotics, but in the Brontes' time, it could easily become fatal, especially for children. I mean, the symptoms there were quite severe. You had a really high fever, sore throat, vomiting, weakness, and that distinctive red rash that gave the illness its name. Children could become dangerously dehydrated or develop complications very quickly, and families knew that once illness entered a household, it would spread through everyone in a matter of days. So when we read that all 6 Bronte children became ill while Maria herself was already dying, we have to understand just how frightening that situation would have felt inside the parsonage. So suddenly, this one household is carrying everything at once. We have a dying mother, we have 6 seriously ill children, and a father trying to hold the entire situation together. Patrick Bronte does later describe this period in deep emotional terms, talking about darkness, fear, and what he called the greatest load of sorrow he'd ever experienced. And it is in this situation that Aunt Branwell arrives from Cornwall. And she arrives directly into a household in crisis. Now, it's worth saying that this may have been the first time she really got to know the young Bronte children. In any meaningful way, of course, because although she'd been involved with the family early on, like we said when she was in Thornton, she'd returned to Cornwall in the following year, before the older children were able to remember her clearly. And of course, Branwell, Emily and Anne hadn't even been born when she left in 1816. So in many ways, the relationship we associate with her are really beginning here, in the middle of this crisis. And what we see immediately is that her role is not symbolic, it's practical. She steps straight into the centre of the household, and she's helping to care for Maria, her sister. She is supporting Patrick, and she is managing the servants. And she is helping bring some kind of order to a house that is under enormous strain. Patrick Bronte himself later writes very warmly about her presence, describing her as a source of great comfort, sharing his burdens and acting in many ways as the affectionate mother to the children. And I think that tells us something important, because it is not just about tasks or organisation. This is about emotional survival in the middle of a family catastrophe. She is not running the house in the sense of cooking and domestic labour. That would have been done by the servants like Tabby. Her role is more supervising, more personal, more about holding things together emotionally and practically at the same time. And I do sometimes think it's interesting to consider what this moment meant for her personally, because she was unmarried, without children of her own, and living in Cornwall before this call for help came. And suddenly she is pulled into the centre of the household in crisis, where she's needed in a very real and immediate way. And it's hard not to wonder whether she simply just rose to the challenge, or whether there was also that sense that this was now her role in life, the place where she was needed most. Because in a household like this, during a crisis like this, she's not an outsider looking in. She is essential. And then, just weeks after her arrival, poor Maria dies on the 15th of September 1821. So the time the two sisters actually spent together is painfully short. I mean, it's a matter of weeks rather than months, which makes what happens next even more significant. Because after Maria's death, Aunt Branwell does not return to Cornwall. She stays in Haworth. She stays to help the whole family through their loss, and it maybe helped her grieve the loss of her sister too. And from that point on, her life becomes fully bonded with the Bronte household. And what began as this short-term act of support becomes something much more permanent than anyone could have ever planned. It becomes the structure of the next 20 years of her life. As the children recover and life slowly starts to settle again in Haworth, we begin to see another side of Aunt Branwell emerging. Not just the caregiver, not just the woman who arrived during the crisis, but someone who helped shape the atmosphere of the household itself. And I think this is really important because sometimes people imagine the Haworth Parsonage as this bleak, silent place where the children somehow magically became writers in isolation. But the home they grew up in was intellectually alive. There were books, there were magazines, newspapers, religious writing, discussions, storytelling, debates, all moving through the house constantly. And Aunt Branwell is very much part of that environment. We know she was very well read. We know she discussed literature and religious confidently. And we even have accounts of her debating things with Patrick Bronte himself. And I always think that detail really matters more than people realise, because Patrick was a clergyman. He was the head of the household and a very educated man in his own right. So for Aunt Branwell to openly argue her opinions with him and do so confidently, without fear, suggests a woman who was secure in her own thoughts and beliefs. She was not timid intellectually. She clearly felt her voice mattered inside that house. And honestly, where else would the Bronte sisters have learnt some of that confidence from? Because yes, the sisters understood the expectations placed on them as women at that time. They knew how women were expected to behave socially, especially as daughters of a clergyman. They would absolutely have known how to conduct themselves properly in public. But inside the home itself, female voices clearly mattered. The women in that house discussed ideas, they debated, they expressed opinions, and Aunt Branwell seemed to have been part of creating that atmosphere. She also helped shape the girls in much more practical ways as well, not just academically, but socially. She taught them the sort of things expected of respectable middle-class women at that time. How to present yourself, how to behave in company, sewing, manners, conversation, household order, all those things that were considered part of being a lady in the 19th century. And that role would have actually been incredibly important because Patrick Bronte could educate his daughters intellectually, but he could not teach them how women were expected to move through society. And Tabby, bless her, although deeply loved by the family, came from a completely different social and educational background. So she would not have been teaching the girls middle-class social expectations either. That guidance really seems to have fallen to our good old Aunt Branwell. And you can actually see her influence especially strongly with Anne, because Anne Bronte is often described as the quietest and gentlest of the siblings, and she appears to have had a particularly close relationship with Aunt Branwell, who helped oversee much of her early learning and domestic instruction. And there is something rather touching about that connection, because in many ways Aunt Branwell herself becomes the quiet, stabilising force within the household. Not always the loudest presence, not necessarily the most dramatic, but constant, reliable, steady. And I think Anne probably responded very strongly to that steadiness. Now, when it comes to Branwell, the relationship feels slightly more complicated. There are definitely hints that Aunt Branwell was fond of him, perhaps even indulgent at times, and as the only boy in the household and the great hope of the family. But she would also be strict, and there are stories that suggest she believed very strongly in proper behaviour, duty and emotional discipline. I mean, one story that's often repeated is that after the death of his older sister Elizabeth, young Branwell was encouraged, or possibly instructed, to kiss his dead sister goodbye, something he apparently found deeply distressing and resisted. Now, like quite a lot of Bronte anecdotes, it is difficult to know exactly how much has been softened or altered or dramatised over time, so I think we should be careful here about treating every detail as absolute fact. But whether the story is perfectly accurate or not, it does fit with the wider sense we get with Aunt Branwell as someone who believed children should confront difficult realities properly with duty and composure. And really, when you think about the world she came from, that attitude makes sense. This was a generation very familiar with illness, death, religion and responsibility from a very early age. So by the time the Bronte children are growing up in Haworth, Aunt Branwell is no longer simply the aunt who stayed behind. She's become one of the major shaping influences in the emotional, intellectual and social world of the household. And I honestly do not think we can fully understand the Bronte sisters without recognising how much of their daily upbringing happened under her influence. So I moved to a different bench because I started to feel a bit chilly in the shadow of that other bench. So I'm at another corner in the same walled garden and I have the sun on me. But it means, unfortunately, I look like a bit of a diva and have to leave my sunglasses on because it is so bright. And because I've got pale blue eyes, what I find is that as soon as the sun comes out, I can't cope with the brightness. So I'm sorry if I look like a diva. But the amount of times you see me in woolly hats and gloves and coping with the cold, for once seeing me cope with the heat, it's not necessarily a bad thing, is it? But yes, beautiful bench. Oh, and I can see the whole garden in front of me. It's lovely. I don't know if this is something that happens as you get older, but I did a talk on the Brontes in Little Ousburn a few weeks ago. Oh, it was an amazing. I can't tell you how wonderful the food was that they served there. I could have stayed in the village hall eating that all day. And they had open gardens, and between doing the two talks I went for a little wander around the gardens, and I really appreciated the work and effort that people put into gardens. I've never really been a big gardener. I'm not very good at it, I must admit, but suddenly I was thinking, oh, I quite like that plant. Oh, I quite like this. So I think maybe it's something you hit as you get older. You appreciate gardens much more, and I think that's why coming here I like it, because it's all very neat and tidy. And yeah, I will show you round, I promise. But the birds are happy, and there's a tree just out of shot and there's quite a few birds sitting in there, so you might hear them. Shall we go back and chat about our good old Aunt Branwell? Just watching, there's some swallows. Sorry, distracted again. Some swallows that are coming over the garden wall, diving down, must be getting the insects, and almost doing sort of like a flyby, and back up again. They are so skilled, aren't they? I don't think I could be a bird in another life. I'd probably end up being the one that crashed into windows all the time. Right, sorry, that was a completely different area we went off on. Right, let's carry on. Blackbird, you're seriously giving me competition, aren't you? Yes, Blackbird, I can hear you. One of the most revealing things about Aunt Branwell is how vivid she begins to appear in the small domestic details of the household. She is described as disliking the cold Yorkshire climate, which is not surprising because when you think about where she came from and the weather there. I mean, she would walk around indoors wearing pattens, which were these wooden or metal overshoes designed to lift the wearer above the wet, muddy or cold ground. They were originally intended for outdoor use, but in her case, she is wearing them inside the house to protect her feet from the cold stone floors of the parsonage. And that detail alone is quite striking because it must have sounded and looked very odd to the young Brontes. The idea of someone moving through their own home in raised footwear would have made her feel slightly out of step with everyone else, quite literally. She's also described as wearing old-fashioned caps and silk garments, clothing that, by the standards of the younger generation, would already have looked dated. But I think it's important not to read that as carelessness or decline, because actually she simply belonged to an earlier generation. Fashion was changing, and like many women of her age, she had no real reason to completely remake her identity to suit younger styles. I mean, if anything, it feels quite familiar because most of us have clothes we've kept because we like them, not because they're fashionable. And it's just that in her case, it's recorded and noticed. She also talks a great deal about her younger life. She remembers Cornwall, she talks about Penzance, and she recalls her social life, the warmth of family gatherings, a world that feels much more open and lively than the Yorkshire parsonage she's now living in. And I think that matters because it tells us she is not withdrawn or a joyless figure. She is someone who carries her past with her quite openly. Someone who tells stories, someone who shares her memories. And in a way, she seems to hold those two worlds inside her at once. We've got Cornwall that she came from and the Yorkshire household that she's never left. And within that household, she is not a passive presence. We see disagreements, particularly over practical domestic matters. There's one particularly striking moment involving the household servant Tabby, because in the December of 1836, Tabby suffers a very serious accident after slipping on ice and breaking her leg badly. I mean, it's a major injury, and at the time there's a real uncertainty about her recovery and what the safest course of action should be. A practical question then arises about how she should be cared for, because Aunt Branwell takes a more practical position. She's concerned about the strain on the household, the difficulty of nursing a seriously injured servant within this busy home, and the limits of what realistically can be managed day to day inside the parsonage. I mean, the young Brontes take a far more emotional view. For them, Tabby's not just a servant, she is someone who's been part of their lives for years, almost part of the family, and they feel strongly that she should be cared for at home, surrounded by familiarity rather than removed somewhere else. And what follows is quite revealing, because this is not a household where one voice simply overrides all the others. There is disagreement, there is resistance, and there is eventually compromise. And it tells us something quite important about Aunt Branwell's position in the home. She's not controlling the household through force or strict authority. She is negotiating within the living, functioning household where different generations and different instincts are considered in conversation with each other. We also see her taking part in everyday intellectual life inside the home, reading aloud with Patrick Bronte, joining conversations, engaging in discussions and debate. I mean, this is lived-in presence, not a background character standing silently in the corner. And it's worth asking, in terms of her wider life, what her position would have been if she had never come to Haworth at all. Because by this point, both of her parents, Thomas and Anne Branwell, unfortunately have already died, and several of her siblings have died too, or were either married or building their own lives elsewhere. And in many ways, she was an unmarried woman in the early 19th century with limited independent options. Without a household of her own, she might easily have remained dependent within a sibling's house or lived a very quieter and much smaller existence in Cornwall. But in Haworth, her position becomes something quite defined. She's useful, she's trusted, and she's relied upon. She helps with their education, with discipline, with order, and with the emotional stability of the household. And although she's not the wife of the house, she does in practice carry many of those responsibilities associated with the senior woman in the home. So rather than being a marginal or slightly forgotten figure, she becomes central to how the household actually functions day to day. And I think that is where we start to see her properly, not as a stereotype, but as a real active presence within the Brontes' world. As the years go on, Aunt Branwell's role becomes increasingly financial as well as domestic. And I think this is something that often gets slightly flattened in the way that the Bronte story is told, because we tend to picture the Haworth Parsonage as permanently struggling, which is often words, but we don't always stop to notice who was quietly helping to subsidise it from the inside. By this stage, Elizabeth Branwell is not just part of the household emotionally and practically. She's also part of its financial structure. She contributes to the household costs, which must have been a weight off poor Patrick's shoulders, what with 8 people living and eating in the parsonage during this time. Now, we can't put an exact figure on her income because the records simply don't survive in that neat, transparent way. But historians generally believe she had a modest independent income from family investments and inheritance and things like that, likely in the region of £50 to £100 a year. Now, to put that in context, a skilled wool comber in Haworth in the 1830s might earn somewhere in the region of 7 to 12 shillings a week, depending on work and obviously demand. And if you average that across a full year, it might come to about £20 to £30, although in reality it was often far less stable than that. A governess, on the other hand, at that time might earn in the simpler range between about £20 to £40 a year, but with far more regularity and social standing. So when we place Aunt Branwell's income, estimated at between £50 and £100 a year from investments and what have you, we're not talking about wealth on a grand scale. We are talking about general financial independence. She was comfortably above the working life in Haworth, and that independence is part of what allowed her to step into the role she did within the Bronte household. So not wealth in a grand sense, but absolutely enough to live independently and, crucially, enough to contribute to others. And she does. She becomes involved in decisions about education, travel and the long-term direction of the Bronte children's lives. Now, when it comes to specific events, we need to be careful because we do not have complete financial ledgers for every decision. But what we can say is that she repeatedly contributed to key moments where money is the deciding factor. One of the clearest examples is the education of Charlotte and Emily in Brussels. Now, we know from surviving accounts that the cost of studying abroad in the 1840s was significant. Roughly speaking, a period of 6 months tuition and board could cost in the region of £40 to £50 per student, before you've even added travel, books, clothing and obviously additional living expenses. So if we translate that into modern terms, we're probably looking at something around about £5,000 to £6,500 per student just for the core tuition period. And considering more once everything is included. We cannot say that Aunt Branwell paid a single fixed amount in a neat transaction because it simply isn't documented that way. But what we can say is that she was part of the financial framework that made those decisions possible. And she set clear limits on what the family could realistically afford. She's not writing blank cheques. Do people even write cheques nowadays? But she is shaping what is financially possible and what is not. And then we see another important financial responsibility in relation to good old Branwell Bronte. On at least one occasion, she stands shortly for him. Now that sounds quite formal, but in simple terms, it means she guarantees his financial obligation. So if he fails to pay or meet a commitment, she is legally responsible for covering it. And that's not a small gesture. That is a form of financial risk. It tells us she trusted him enough or believed in him enough at that moment to attach her own security to his behaviour. It also tells us something about her role in the family more broadly. She's not just observing from the side, she is actively absorbing responsibility for outcomes. Now, later on, we also see her involved in discussions around the idea of the Brontes attempting to establish their own school right there in the parsonage. Again, we don't have precise confirmed figures for her contribution, but based on the scale of the discussions in Emily's letters, the proposal's start-up cost appears to have been in the region of about £100 to £150 total capital, which would be about £12,000 to £20,000 in modern terms. Of course, the school idea never did take off, but she was willing to help. This was not a simple gift. It was conditional, carefully considered, and linked to whether the plan was actually viable. And this is where we see one of the most important dynamics in her character. She's not simply enabling ambition, she is balancing ambition with realism. We see it clearly in Charlotte's own letters, where there is this constant tension between excitement and anxiety, between possibility and financial fear. Charlotte is thinking in terms of opportunity and future independence, and Aunt Branwell is thinking in terms of sustainability and survival. And those two perspectives sit side by side inside that same decision. She makes things possible, but she also keeps them grounded. And I think that is a really important part of understanding her influence. Because without that financial presence, however carefully controlled, many of the Bronte's family's plans would have simply not have been possible at all. So when we look at her role overall, it's not just domestic support, and it's not just emotional stability, it's also financial architecture. Quiet, careful, but absolutely central to the structure of the Bronte's household and the opportunities the children were able to pursue. By the late 1830s and early 40s, the household is changing yet again. The children are no longer children. They are beginning to live increasingly separate lives, and the parsonage is no longer this tightly bonded family unit it once was. Charlotte and Emily are, of course, in Brussels, continuing their studies. Anne is working as a governess at Thorpe Green. And Branwell, well, he's trying to establish himself in work, moving between roles and struggling to find his stability. So even before anything else happens, the family's already physically scattered, and the emotional centre of that household is under strain. And then Aunt Branwell falls ill. And this is the point where everything begins to tighten again. Her health declines steadily, and it becomes clear that she is not recovering. Accounts describe her illness as severe and prolonged, involving intense abdominal pain, and what is often recorded as an internal obstruction. I mean, in modern medicine, and in modern medicine terms, it was possible this could have been treated, or at least managed. But in the early 1840s, there was very little that could be realistically done beyond obviously care, comfort and observation. She's attended by a doctor and she's nursed within the house, but the outcome becomes increasingly inevitable. And what is particularly striking is the emotional weight of this moment for the family. Branwell Bronte writes of her as someone who has been like a mother to him. His grief is immediate and deeply personal, and in his letter we see how central she'd been in his sense of emotional stability, and that gives us a sense of how each of the children relate to her in different ways, not just as an adult or as an aunt, but as a constant figure in their upbringing. Aunt Branwell dies on the 29th of October 1842 after several days of severe illness. She's been unwell for a relatively short but intense period at the end of her life, and her final days are marked by significant suffering, with her condition worsening despite the care. She dies in the parsonage, surrounded by the household that she has effectively shaped for over 2 decades. And then everything changes very quickly. Her funeral takes place on the 3rd of November 1842 at St Michael's and All Angels Church in Haworth, close to where her beloved sister Maria Bronte and the rest of the family are buried, as she had wished. Patrick Bronte is there, Branwell is there, and Anne, who is able to return from Thorpe Green, is also there. But poor Charlotte and Emily are not present, still abroad in Brussels, and they receive the news far too late. And there is something quite striking about that separation, even at the moment of death. The family is already no longer fully together in the way it once was. Letters travel between them instead of people, and Charlotte writes with a sense of distance and shock, describing the world feeling suddenly altered and emptied. And it really does feel like that, because for over 20 years Aunt Branwell has been part of the structure, holding everything together. Not just emotionally, but practically and of course financially as well. She's been that person who's helped stabilise illness in the early years, who supported education decisions, who's contributed to travel and opportunities, who's absorbed the risk when needed, but who's provided this steady presence inside a household that was often under strain. Once she is gone, that structure doesn't simply continue. It shifts. The household becomes lighter in one sense, but also far more exposed in another. Servants, such as our Tabby and Martha, they take on more of the day-to-day domestic burden, but there is no longer that sense of sort of central stabilising adult presence alongside Patrick. Emotionally, the loss runs through all of them in very different ways. Charlotte later reflects on the sense of absence and change that follows, and even in practical terms, the house feels altered, as if one of its main foundations has been removed. And in many ways, that is exactly what has happened. Because for over 20 years, Aunt Branwell has not just lived in the Haworth Parsonage, she has helped hold it all together. Excuse me, would have simply not have been possible. On at least one occasion, she stands shortly. So when we step back from all of this, what do we actually see? We see a woman who left her home in Cornwall and entered a household already marked by illness, grief and responsibility. We see someone who became a caregiver, a manager, an educator, a financial supporter, and a constant presence in the lives of the Bronte children. We see someone who argued, who advised, who negotiated, who cared, who stayed. And perhaps most importantly, we see someone who has often been reduced in history to a stereotype that does not fully reflect the evidence we actually have. Not a tyrant, not a background figure, but a real woman with opinions, habits, memories, limitations, and a very long period of sustained involvement in one of the most famous literary families in English history. And when you look at her life a little more closely, there is also something quite poignant underneath it all, because she never returned to Cornwall. We do not actually know whether she was always believed she would one day go back, but it's very easy to imagine at first her stay in Yorkshire felt temporary, a period of family duty, a few months, maybe a year at the most. But years passed, then decades, and you do start to wonder what that shift must have felt like, whether she ever looked back and realised this was no longer a visit but a permanent life, whether she ever missed the sea or the warmth of Penzance or the social world that she came from, and whether there was a moment where she understood that her identity had changed from Elizabeth Branwell of Cornwall into Aunt Branwell of Haworth, because that is quite a transformation when you think about it. And yet within that life she didn't simply disappeared. She shaped things, she stabilised things, she gave structure, guidance, and in many ways opportunities to the Bronte children. She cared for them as if they were her own, and she clearly remained deeply involved in their lives right to the very end. And I do think there's something very human in that. A woman who stepped into a crisis, stayed far longer than expected, and in doing so became part of the foundations of something much larger than any of them could have known at the time. Okay, she did not write the novels we still read today, but she helped create the conditions in which they could be written. And sometimes those are exactly the people we forget to look for. Now, I would really love to hear what you think about this. So I've got my 3 questions for you. So number 1, do you see her as someone who lost her own independent life to family duties? And number 2, was she someone who found purpose and importance in the role she ended up having within the Bronte household? And number 3, do you think she ever truly saw Haworth as home, or did Cornwall remain, in her mind, the place she belonged to all along? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I genuinely love reading your ideas and your different interpretations of these lives. And like I say every week, if you enjoyed this video or any of my videos, please do that whole likey, subscribey, hypey thing, because it really does help me out and it lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Bronte content. Have a good weekend, look after yourselves, enjoy the weather, and I will see you all the Friday after next for more Bronte adventures. Okay, take care. Bye.